Thank you. So, colleagues, this is a continuation of what is an initiative of Biop Caucus as an interest group to have what these clumsy webinar conversations. And we have a whole range of topics that we have laid out for over the next couple of months to deal with this particular issue, especially from a systemic racism perspective. For those of you who were there the last time, I spoke a little bit about the impact of mental models and how that drives unconscious bias and what are the implications of what that, how it plays out in kind of broader society, and then also the impact of that in organizations. Today, we're dealing with another topic, and these are clumsy conversations. The intent is to put some of these topics on the table and then invite conversation from the floor with regard to the topic being discussed. And so let me just briefly say to you that our Clumsy webinar conversations is to be around critical transformation issues with a view that we will adopt a conversational style of discovery rather than one of finality. So I invite you really to participate in the conversation so that we can begin to move this kind of thing forward for Siopsa and hopefully for the broader society. But we also want to ensure that there is a psychological safe space that can stimulate more authentic conversation. It is not going to help us if we don't have authentic conversation around it. And so we want to create the space where people would feel free to be able to do so. The format is, I'll spend about 15 minutes, maybe in less, to just introduce the topic, and then I will invite the floor to participate in that conversation. And then at the end, we will do a brief summation of what were some of the key things that came through from our conversation. So let's launch into it. What we're talking about today is critical race theory. And you might recall that it is something that came very much to the fore during that period when Black Lives Matter kicked off with the Floyd, being killed by the police in the US, and how this thing kind of just, got right across the world where people became involved in this Black Lives Matter issue. A lot of talk about this critical race theory. So let's try and answer the question, what is this about? The CRT movement, critical race theory movement, is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship with regard to race, racism, and power. And this came out of the book of Delgado and Stefanchik, who wrote an introduction to critical race theory, and I'll show you the reference later on. So critical race theory is about the practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in society. It critiques how social constructionism of race and institutional racism perpetuates a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. And I want to just tell you a little bit about the roots, which will tell you a little bit more about, so how did this develop? And then to end off specifically with the basic tenets of critical racism, critical race theory. In the 1960s, probably the father of what is critical race theory, Derek Bell, considered to be the father of CRT, made some major contributions to the civil rights movement. But as you will see, it took almost another decade for what he started off in terms of the challenge that he put into society around race, especially in the United States, and being part of that civil rights movement, only a decade later, the formative years of CRT basically kicked off. And it was initially within the legal departments of universities. That's why you will see it came out of critical legal studies, because they were arguing that the law was not objective or apolitical, rather complicit in maintaining an unjust social order. And they were obviously specifically referring to the United States, but as you can see, it's something that's applicable right across the globe. And so a lot of work happened in that kind of decade within the legal studies departments of universities. And in the 1980s, Kimberly Crenshaw was another big name within critical race theory, who also coined the phrase critical race theory, because the name didn't exist as such prior to Kimberly Crenshaw actually talking about it as critical race theory. She and other students and supporters, they organized a protest against Harvard's lack of racial diversity in the curriculum. This boycott marked the beginnings of CRT as an intellectual movement, and later signifying an intersection of critical theory and race, racism, and the law. Now, critical theory is something that came out of what is called the Frankfurt School, with people like Habermas, Adorno, Horkheimer, and they said that theory shouldn't just be about describing the phenomenon, or which was kind of the mainstream way of looking at research, or the counter view, which was kind of the more interpretivist view, to say we also must make sense of those phenomena and put interpretations to it. What critical theory does is that it adds a third dimension, and that's where the critical comes from, is a normative dimension about research. That your research can't just be about describing or interpreting it. You also have a desire to change the status quo after you have done those first two things. And that is what is critical about it. Further into the 1990s, the emergence of key concepts of and features of critical race theory came about. So, for example, Bell in the 1970s spoke about a very important concept within critical race theory called interest convergence, and I will talk to you about it. And also Crenshaw specifically speaking about what is called intersectionality. And again, I will describe the concept a bit later. But these were kind of the key features beginning to emerge now within critical race theory. In the 2000s, there was then beginning to be a little bit more scholarly work being done around it. So Delgado and Stefancic in 2001 wrote this introduction to critical race theory, which unpacks concepts like interest convergence as a means of understanding Western racial history. CRT also began to show up in the curricula of law schools, and it began to move into other groups other than, say, Black. So, for example, Latin Americans started off with a group called Latino Crit, which was LatCrit, or people who came out of the LGBTQI plus kind of movement, Queer Crit, or Asians within that context also beginning to do critical studies, what is called Asian Crit. And there's even I don't know the specific name, an indigenous Crit, which has to do with Native Americans, looking at colonialism and its impact of that and racism on where they find themselves. In 2020, Donald Trump actually put out an executive order which was trying to squash any further training of CRT in schools. And that almost had a backlash because there was this campaign, Truth Be Told, and it had to do with the fact that they were trying, what he was trying to do by squashing it, he actually made it more popular because people then began to ask, what is the CRT about? So what he intended was just a reverse of what he wanted to achieve with such an executive order. And then just finally, in terms of just setting the scene around it, some of the key figures that if you want to go and read about critical race theory more, I've obviously spoken about Derry Bell. There are other people like Alan Freeman, Kimberly Shaw is a big, Crenshaw is a big name in it, Angela Harris, Charles Lawrence, Patricia Williams, Neil Gotanda, Eric Yamamoto. And you can see this is where the Asian crit comes in, even with Mari Matsuda. Richard Delgado, I've mentioned to you earlier, who wrote that introduction, Kevin Johnson, Margaret Montoya, Juan Perea, Francisco Valdez. So these are just some names that would be associated with critical race theory. And if you want to read about it, these are the names that you would look up. So what I'd like to do now, and concluding that introduction to CRT, is basically to tell you what it is about. And in that regard, I will take you basically through, because I'm not trying to do a masterclass on it. I'm trying to just give you a sense of what critical race theory is about. And if you understand its basic tenets or have some insight into it, you'll understand, well, this is what critical race theory is about, and to go and explore, read more if there are any particular areas that are of interest to you. So the basic tenets. The first thing that CRT would say is race still matters, despite the misguided protestations of a post-racial era. In other words, there's a lot of people who kind of say to us, you know, race is not actually an issue. Why do you guys still talk about race? Which is in itself what we would call a microaggression, because it's almost like invalidating the experience of a person who still experiences racism at the moment. Why are you still talking? So one of the key concepts within, from a CRT point of view, is race still matters. A second basic tenet of CRT is that race is socially constructed. It's not biological, and it's definitely not natural. It's a product of social thought and relations. It's not objective. It's not inherent. It's not fixed. It's not biological or genetic. It's a pseudo-permanent characteristic imposed on Black people. So race is then defined as prejudice plus power. And in this particular instance, we're talking about institutional power, but it could also be systemic, it could also be structural. And I will talk to that a little bit later. But race is not just purely about prejudice. It's also having the power to impose what is prejudicial in this particular instance. A third concept of CRT is that racism is normal, not aberrational. What do we mean by this? It's simply saying that racism as an outgrowth of white supremacy is not the elephant in the room, it is the room. It's a bit like fish in water. A fish does not know that it is in water unless you put the fish on dry land. The fish will realize, oh, there is a context like water. It's so pervasive that you cannot see it any longer. And we are saying that racism is a bit like that. It is no longer some elephant in the room. It's actually so deeply ingrained in the structures and the systems of society that everybody asks us, why do you still talk about it when we do not see it? And it's precisely because we are blinded of being in the water like fish. And that makes it very difficult to cure because it's so common. It's an ordinary experience of people of color. It's an experience that they just go through all the time to a bigger or lesser extent. It's not something that you experience from time to time. I was interested to see the editor of News 24, News 24, Adrian Besson, saying that the incident that happened at Stellenbosch the other day is not specifically, and so let me just be clear, it's not me saying it's him, a white person, a white male. He's saying that maybe the problem about that student having done what he did is not an individual act of that person who must be held accountable, obviously, for his actions, but he was asking the question, is it not sitting in the system in Stellenbosch University that allows this kind of thing to happen? And that's what we're talking about. It's inside the system that is creating opportunities for people to do it. It's not just purely about, some individual act of racism. Some of those critics seem to cast racism as a personal characteristic first and foremost, is a problem caused mainly by bigots who practice overt discrimination and to frame discussions about racism as shaming, accusatory, and divisive. In other words, it's not just this individual thing we're talking about, it's pervasive, it's around us, it's the water that we find ourselves in society. A fourth concept of critical race theory is that of interest convergence or material determinism. And by that, it means so long as the interest of the dominant group, and in this particular instance, the white group within society, so long their interests are, in some way satisfied in terms of what Black people are doing. So if your particular thing that you do as a Black person in society converge with their particular interest, it will be promoted. Otherwise, there will be very little incentive. And if from that point of view, because of this interest conversion, so long what we do converge with the interests of a white person, we will not be able to cure and deal with this issue of racism. And that's where this whole concept of interest conversions come from, as coined by Derek Bell. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, how pervasive the system is, often we hear a white person, not all white people, so let's not generalize here, and kind of ask, why is it that the Black person takes so long to get to this point of having achieved what the white person has achieved? But as you can see from this graphic, it is a hell of a process that a Black person has to go through in order to get exactly to where the other person, the white person, is at, because that path is much more easier than what a Black person experienced. And that's what we mean by this blindness around not seeing how racism impacts us. So let's move on with, just in interest of time, another concept of critical race theory is what we call differential racialization. And what we mean by this is whereby not all people of color are seen from the point of view of the dominant group as being not in their interest. So for example, we might find a person that clearly emulates the values of a white person, for example, will have a more positive attribution than a person who doesn't. And what that does amongst Black people is that they also see that there are people of different classes amongst people of color who have, because they share less the interests and maybe the value system and whatever else and the needs of white people. And so it's not almost the same thing. There's a bit of a distinction of how these people are seen even within the whole group of people of color or Black people. Then there is the notion of intersectionality. And by this, we simply mean that although we can speak about a Black person is also a woman. And she's a lesbian or a feminist or a Christian. So let's deal with the one as a woman. In other words, if you were to talk about a Black woman in South Africa, that person probably experienced oppression double, because it's not only about race, but also about gender. And that's what we mean by this concept of intersectionality. Similarly, you could say a Black person who is a lesbian will have oppression in two ways. First of all, as a Black person, and then as a queer person. Then there's also what we call the voice of color, by which we mean that Black people or people of color are best suited to speak, and they're all qualified to speak on behalf of their members of the different forms and effects of racism. That's basically what we mean by the voice of color. So a Black person can speak on behalf of Black people as to the oppression and the racism that has been experienced. A very important basic tenet of critical race theory is counter-storytelling. And the idea of counter-storytelling is simply to say that history has been revised by white people so much to the extent that a whole Black history has been blocked out of that history. And therefore, it is necessary for Black people to counter-story tell what has actually happened and is happening right now. I was just recently quite interested by my daughter. First time I heard about somebody called Mansa Musa, who was probably one of the richest Africans in the history of the world. I never knew of this person coming out of the Mali Empire. But this is how history has been revised to block out a Black history in favor of just what is now considered to be mostly a white history. And it's therefore we need to begin to change that narrative around what is actually happened in history. Then the issue around structural determinism, and by this we simply mean that the point which I made earlier, the issue of racism is so in the system, it has become like the water for us as the fish inside the water. And therefore, we need to begin to look for new ways and new vocabulary to redress those wrongs that we are beginning to see now in the system and in the structure. Another critical feature of critical race theory is a critique of liberalism. Liberalism says we mustn't see color, we must be colorblind, or we must treat everything on merit. The problem, as I've already pointed out, that it's so embedded in our thought processes and social structures that by doing that, we can never be able to overcome the effects of racism. Therefore, employment equity is important. As to whether we do it well or not well, that's a different issue. But the issue is that there is a need for equitable redress with regard to it. As you can see, critical race theory has got an absolute commitment to social justice. And finally, it also acknowledges the issue of interdisciplinarity, which means it's not just about what comes out of legal. We must now learn from psychology, sociology, and together these begin to make up a view of what how can we begin to address the issue of race and racism in society. Colleagues, that is basically the story of critical race theory as a very brief introduction, not intended to give you a full class around it, but rather to say we need to begin to just think about some of these issues. And I invite you now into a conversation around these issues. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the whole group in the session. If you have got questions about any particular area, we can talk obviously about it. But I invite your comments and conversation on this topic of critical race theory and how perhaps when we do understand it better, how can we learn and be informed by what comes out of it to deal with redress and restorative justice and changing and transformation. How can we deal with it better? Because we're better informed, we've got better tools in our hands. So how can we begin to address it and deal with this issue as we move forward? I invite your comments and questions on this particular matter. Please, let's see. Anybody? It normally goes slow at the beginning, but then it picks up. So who's going to be the person who gets the ball rolling for us so I can stop talking? Questions, comments?
Yeah, I'll jump in for a second, Andrew. Thank you so
Thanks,
much
Rob.
for that. Thank you so much for that introduction as well. I've done a bit of my own CRT research, but that one you've done there is just so succinct and so academically referenced. I really appreciate it and what you shared. And it makes me think of a few things. One was just in some of, and I'm a novice, just to preference that. I'm still learning in this space. But it makes me think about the things that make the headlines, and that is CRT in schools, right?
Right.
Lately, and it makes me think, is CRT, should CRT be taught to minority groups or white groups? Is it does one need it more than the other? Is perhaps my perhaps my question that I'm thinking about. Because
Sure.
at the outs, and I did do a quick research of those authors as well, and not all of them were Black, which was really interesting to me as well. A lot of the seminal authors were, but some of them weren't. And I think perhaps it's my own identity coming to the forefront of how does my ethnicity fit into this conversation as well. And I just wondered that question around education, because I remember a colleague once said to me it was being taught by one of his family members at a private school in Johannesburg, and he was completely triggered by it, and he said he wants to pull his kid out. And myself, and he's a white person, and we had a very honest conversation about what it actually means and the soft, fragile whiteness that got triggered for him. But it makes me think that, it seems like it might be angled more towards white people, or they have the greater need to understand it. Is that perhaps the case, or is there a bit more thoughts around who is the target audience of CRT, if not everyone?
Sure. Thanks for that, Rob. I think maybe one can learn from what actually happened in the US. It was just a view of putting it into schools. And as I indicated earlier, it's precisely why Trump was trying to stop it, because they put it out in schools for everybody to learn. Here's the issue. I don't think it is only about white people learning about it. It's also Black people, because the challenge that we've been talking about for a long time now, as you will recall yourself, is that on the one hand, you do have white supremacy and white privilege that need to be talked about, and where does it fit into the system and so on. But on the other hand, you also have Black internalized racism. And if they don't understand some of these things that we're talking about, and to be informed about, so how is Black internalized oppression, is it an inherent quality that I have as a person? No, it isn't. It has been caused by something else, by white supremacy, where people felt put down, and not just felt put down, but were actually literally put down, because if you disagreed, there could be serious consequences for you as to how, for example, society will operate. And as you know, coming from a history of apartheid in South Africa, there was a violent system that says it will be like this. So it's not like you can say, okay, I feel whether I can take it on. To the extent that we find, and I made this point the last time, to the extent that many of our parents, when they were still relating to the people that they work for, they found it difficult to say meneer. They still said baas, they still said missus. And that is the kind of mentality that was driven into people, over time. So the education around this is not just for white people. I think it is for everybody to be able to understand how this thing is from a point of view of a white person, but also from a Black person. That would be my view, Rob. What do you think?
I think it's fantastic, it's particularly the part around internalized discrimination or racism, how we formed our worldview by this unconscious status quo that reinforces us and them, which affects both parties on either side, right? I actually remember watching something recently where they talked about critical race theory in The Lion King, believe it or not, in 1994.
Oh, wow.
And the argument there was all the hyenas, which are considered the scum or the outliers of society, were played by African American voices.
Sure.
And it's subtle things like that that perforate into the status quo. And I remember that being a discussion, and that works for both sides of the fence there. And
absolutely,
I find that very interesting to think about.
Thanks, Rob. Very good input. Colleagues, I invite others to contribute. Safe space, say what you need to say. Nobody is going to bite you.
Andrew,
Johan, my goodness, I haven't seen this man for ages. Welcome, Johan.
Good seeing you as well. Thank you for a very illuminating conversation. There's a bit of me that feels uncomfortable, and I think it's just how it should be. My question is, how does critical race theory work with the concept of Blackness? And I'm particularly interested in understanding it, given what you've said earlier, and that is that race is a social construct, but it's also in our racialized society, it also became a marker for the caste system the racial caste system that many of us have grown up in. So is Blackness then a kind of a fluid concept that becomes a matter of personal identity? Does that mean that as a white Afrikaans speaking person, I can self-identify as being Black? Or am I so because of my skin color, am I now so marked with the system of privilege or system of white privilege that it's impossible for me to identify as Black? Perhaps your thought on that.
Sure. I think the first thing, the way I would respond to it, first of all, is to say, obviously, Blackness have been relegated to something bad, negative, and all of that. That's why you will recall movements like Black is beautiful and things like that, even Black Lives Matter. In South Africa, there was obviously a big movement around Black consciousness, because it had to do with the idea that when we look at society, we see how ingrained the negativity around Black has been actually deliberately promoted, and in the language. I mean, you would never say that if you think about something like the white sheep in the family, then it's quite possible you're thinking about something positive. But the Black sheep in the family is something wrong, it's something bad with it, And Black has always been associated with that kind of negativity as opposed to white. So there was a need, I think, on the part of Blacks, first of all, to say, we own our Blackness. Don't think because the system was imposing on us that black is bad, it's wrong, it's terrible, it's ugly. And so black people had to begin to own their blackness, to say we are black and it's beautiful and I own it, I'm a black person. But you will know from black consciousness, for example, never said that white allies cannot become part of that movement. It had to say to people, when you do become part of this movement, it's to help us to promote blackness. It's no longer about talking in vague terms. It's about, and in fact, I can say to you that Biop caucus operates on exactly, the Biop caucus within Siopsa operates exactly on the same principles, to say our white allies, it's totally open for everybody to join the Biop caucus. But what we're trying to do in the Biop caucus is to overcome the very problems that we said has created in the very first instance, us having to think about a Biop caucus. So it's promoting that. So it's first of all for black people to own it. I think as one of our white colleagues said in another session elsewhere, it is about allowing the black person to take the microphone now. It's not to speak on behalf of, it's allowing that the microphone is held by the black person to speak up and for a white person to stand in that situation to support it. By the way, one is not asking of a white ally in this particular instance to be uncritical of the conversation, because we're saying in conversation, there must be an openness to hear other ideas. But those ideas need to be tested as to whether they are valid within the context of what we're operating on and so on. But it's not saying to a white ally, stop being a white person. It's owning your whiteness also. But then to say and recognize, first of all, I step from a position of privilege. Therefore, how can I utilize my privilege to overcome the very problem that we are trying to deal with here right now? It's not saying I'm not a white person any longer. It's owning it. But it is, and by the way, I want to make a distinction between a person saying I'm a white person and adopting the ideology of whiteness, because that's a different thing. It's not the same thing. It's almost like saying, when we talk about white supremacy and we talk about privilege, a white person will own that I am privileged, but it is not adopting that privilege. It's saying, I'm owning up, I'm privileged in it, so how can I utilize it now to overcome other things in it? But it's not saying to a white person, don't stop being white. What we do say is stop your whiteness, which is an ideology, associated with things like white privilege. And even in that, you could even throw in things like white fragility. What do you think, Johan?
Yes, absolutely thoughtful comments that you made. And yes, there's something about, there's a part of our identities that is fluid. So there's part of our identities that are, I don't want to stable, but perhaps, but also, as you say, you can, by dint of the fluidity of what and who you identify with, you can identify in that as in that group as well. Andrew,
and that has to do, sorry, Jan, just to say, that has also to do with intersectionality, whereby I am a white person, but I also associate with these other groups that are there, so you see yourself in these multiple type of identities. When we talk about race, it's to say, I am here to overcome the problem of racism. So we all agreed on it. We just come from different perspectives to it. I just want to say that if you feel uncomfortable, I can guarantee you a lot of Black people also feel uncomfortable when we speak about Black internalized oppression, because it's something that has been so, we operate like that in a way that, for example, last year, Wayne will recall, when we started the Black IOP caucus, some of our colleagues says, yeah, but we can't exclude the whites. We said, why? Why can't we exclude them? Because why is it wrong for us to talk amongst ourselves, first of all, what are the issues that concern us, and even begin to work out how do we address them? And on that basis, we said we want to have that conversation first, but we said white allies were never excluded. Now, you will find even in our next webinar, a white person will speak about whiteness, not a black person. And that is kind of the intent of where we're wanting to go into the future. But our discomfort is across the board. It's not just for white people.
If I can, last question, Andrew, I'm thinking perhaps a bit more theoretically and academically. If we think about, Black critical race theory, so it had its origins, as you correctly mentioned, in the US during the civil rights movement, and there's been a growing, body of academic knowledge in this. Sort of had a few articles recently about critical white studies as well, which I think falls within the same broad academic paradigm. My question is, outside of a white privileged system as what we would experience in, let's sort of say, typically in the West, how universal are the academic theories and principles to other societies where one experiences racism, privilege, and power, but the let's call it the color denominations, black and white, are not present. It may be, between different castes, or maybe be different, different races that are, both black, both Asian,
yeah,
that kind of thing.
So in that particular instance, obviously, depending on whether it's two different kind of groups that you're talking about, it could be ethnicity that is at stake rather than race, okay? That would be my view as to it. So for example, if we can speak about the xenophobia that especially Black South Africans have against other foreign Africans as xeno-racism, because it becomes like a view of looking at people who look like you and basically come from your own particular culture, not necessarily cultural, but kind of race background, but you look down on them because they're foreign. And we even give names to them, like Makwera, just to set ourselves apart. And that's what they would call xeno-racism, because so there are different kind of, elements of this kind of thing that we talk about, the racism. We're not saying, for example, that there isn't individual racism. Each person must be held accountable for your beliefs and your actions. We're not saying that that's an issue, but critical race theory is saying by tackling those kind of individual little things is not going to deal with the issue of racism, because racism is so ingrained in the system and in the structures, fortunately not institutionalized as it used to be in South Africa, that is what we have to deal with in that regard. But we have an expert here on ethnicity, which is Ruwain, and I see his hand is up. Ruwain, come join the conversation.
That's now setting me up, Andrew, in a way that now I'm nervous and I don't want to talk anymore. Listen, so I think for me, from a social psychology perspective, if we think about concepts or constructs such as race and ethnicity, I think what happened in South Africa is that we've conflated these two constructs. And so when we talk about race, it's a more stable, it's still socially constructed. You can't, as we think about this, you can't really choose whether you're black, white, or Asian. It's some, with most people, it's quite apparent. However, when we talk about ethnicity, I could be Zulu, but decide not to practice the Zulu because my mother's Sotho or South Sotho, so ethnicity is more around customs, rituals, and we make a choice in terms of whether we want to follow a particular ethnicity or not. Now, I mean, of course, you know, we all as human beings, we discriminate. We are taught from a very young age to discriminate between different forms or shapes, etc. But as you were talking, I was just thinking, I'm actually in Kigali in Rwanda at the moment, and interesting history in terms of how, you know, ethnic conflict resulted in millions of people being killed in Rwanda. But if you go back to the history of Rwanda, that these people in Rwanda did not distinguish between ethnicities. What happened was that it was the Belgians that came to Rwanda, if you look at the history, and started doing research on ethnicity. And through this research to understand the different people had created this divide. And so for me, if we're talking about critical race theory, you cannot just look at India and look at the caste system. You need to go back to colonialism and how that then colonialism created or contributed to those caste systems. Similarly in Rwanda, if you go back to the history, you know, 1994 was not when the genocide started. It started many centuries ago when Europeans came to this country and started making the distinction between different ethnic groups that was not there before. And so, you know, I think for me, what I appreciate about critical race theory is the fact that we need to go back to the history to understand how race and racism has influenced different societies. And so just my contribution on this particular topic.
In fact, going back into that history, Ruwain, is precisely to show how race has been socially constructed. It is not something that is inherent. And so if you look at the colonial history, how that came about, how slaves had to be created in some ways to make up for you know, an economic issue that they needed to deal with. We can't go into that. But if you go back into that history, you'll begin to understand that the issue of race is entirely socially constructed, and it was there to serve particular interests of people, and especially the interests of the colonial masters. And then you begin to understand, oh my goodness, well, there is a deep issue that we're talking about now, because history has been so revised by white people. You don't hear about those issues in it, and that's why we speak in CRT of counter storytelling, because we need to tell a different story now in order to make this history whole again, because that history has been very one-sided in terms of what it has been saying all of these years. But I'm not sure, Johan, does it help to just not remember these conversations is not to say yes and final answer, but rather to say maybe there's something else to think about.
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Johan. Colleagues, please join in. Are there other comments there? It's been a quiet group here, but I'm sure there are questions on people's minds and contributions you'd like to make for, against. It's conversation of dealing with critical issues in a safe space, but let's speak authentically to each other.
Andrew, if I may follow up on it while we maybe give some opportunity to other colleagues. But what you triggered for me is that I wonder to what extent is our way we think about knowledge and how knowledge is created also racialized, right? And so when I started off the conversation, I talked about social psychology, and I particularly referenced a European, author around this particular work. And as I was talking about it, I realized that I've actually internalized that as a way, as reality. But in that way, I've become complicit in perpetuating that story, right? And so I think also, the point for me is about questioning also where some of knowledge comes from and our understanding of reality as we think about the world that we're living in as well.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, you're pointing to the fact as to how big the task is, because it's tackling it from various angles, from a multidisciplinary point of view, and various things within what had become almost accepted to be the norm might now be challenged to say, whose norm is that? And the generation of knowledge is a very critical thing, because how you, an epistemology of language will say, that kind of knowledge can only be generated by some select group of people. And who is that select group of people? We need to begin to evaluate that and understand what is going on. So you're absolutely right. It's tackling it from various angles in a multidisciplinary way, because the issue, which is not just an elephant which we have to keep on eating at, it is actually an issue that is the room itself. And that makes it even more difficult to begin to deal with this particular issue. Comment? Question? Any question?
So, hi, it's Natasha here. I want to just make a comment and say thank you for sharing your insights on CRT. I think what the conversation leaves me with is how we share this knowledge, how we share this insights to help drive the change that we need in our country. And I think we all need to walk away and identify ways in which each of us can influence the awareness and influence the change that we want. And I think that CRT can help us do that through the storytelling you talk about and having conversations like this. So thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. And I think our intent in a general sense is also to say, if we want to improve our equity, diversity, and inclusion programs, then maybe it is time to talk about the room in a much more authentic way. Because if, a thesis which I had at the Siopsa conference last year was to say that EDI programs seem to have failed, because if one look at representativity, how that has shifted, it hasn't, at least not significantly, to be able to say it comes closer to emulate the kind of, which is used as the benchmark at the moment, the economically active population. It doesn't seem to come close to that. And we ask ourselves, why is that the case? Then maybe we need to think about how we do these EDI programs differently to what we've done before, because while we believe they are achieving things, they're not. Why is that? We need to ask ourselves. Yeah, thanks for that, Natasha. Kutlano, thanks for joining, and then Ruwai.
Andrew, I want go ahead. Sorry, if I could, I need to run. Can I just very quickly,
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. So I just wanted to say, for any of our colleagues that are in Cape Town, we're running a 2-day workshop on this particular topic. The 1st, the 2nd and the 3rd of July, Andrew will be the presenter. It's a 2-day one. The Saturday is online, and then the Sunday is in person. So if any of our colleagues are interested, please contact us, and you can join this complimentary, and you'll get 12 CPD points for this as well. So just wanted to extend that invitation, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Rowan. Thanks for reminding us of that. It's an opportunity to engage that conversation, and we will be looking partly at that history. How did some of these things come about? Kutlana?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I just wanted to just maybe share some of my reflections that I'm having now. I think the biggest thing for me is the topic or theme of like learning how to.
Sorry, we lost you, Kutlano. Now there's load shedding happening around, and
Like, thinking back, if we were to think about America and when Obama was president, and then afterwards them speaking about this sort of white backlash, and then the influx of Trump and all of the magical things he did as a result, I'm wondering, how do we go about introducing CRT as a way, and this is just, I don't know how to do it, but do we do it in such a way where you sort of not call it exactly what it is, sort of feed it in like the way you would put vegetables into the soup without people noticing. Or because I'm really reflecting on my own experiences where I've literally at times had created content that had the term white privilege. And that enough was a trigger where I was told by a client that actually, please don't include that. And that white part was just too much. And I'm wondering, I'm just wondering how do we include this and introduce it within the South African context?
Sure.
Not just also wondering, what are we ready for? How do we create that readiness? In a way that people almost don't realize that they're ready. I don't know.
Sure. Maybe one need to say that is part of the problem not that we speak in muted terms around the issue. Now, speaking more robustly and clearly about what the issue is doesn't have to be done in this respectful way. We're not suggesting that. We're simply saying, let's talk about the thing which is actually the problem. So must we talk about racism and say, no, I think the different people don't seem to deal with each other so well, and we cloud it. So, for example, here's a good example of it, my view. When we have been calling these programs diversity programs, we almost lost totally the plot that their intent and the outcome that they were looking for with regard to it is an equitable workplace. But we don't speak, and that's why I deliberately now speak about equity, diversity, and inclusion, not diversity only, because in that conversation, we spoke about all diversity, and what happens is that the issue of race got totally lost in it. The result is we never deal with the issue actually up front. We speak about it in these very vague terms. I think it is time, if we're going to have authentic conversation, let's talk about the issue. It's going to make us uncomfortable. It's going to create a sense of sensitivity about it. But what is required now is to have authentic conversation. And authentic conversation is going to require of us to speak about the issues more directly. We can't couch it in some nice feel-good terms and so on. And it's got nothing to do with being disrespectful to people. Of course, we're not asking you to be disrespectful, but we'll speak quite clearly and upfront about that particular issue. Good, Lana?
Yeah. I'm digesting what you're saying.
Sure.
I agree.
It's not a final answer, by the way. It's simply
it's not
saying,
easy.
It's simply saying, if we're going to continue to speak it in these muted terms, I am almost 100% certain we will not be able to achieve what we're setting out to do. That's my view. Diversity training for the last 27 years is a prime example of the problem that we're talking about, because everything else was spoken about except to say, and where's race in all of this? We need to talk more upfront and more robustly about the issue of race. My view. Okay.
Thank you.
Is Zonke still here, or she dropped off because she was next? She seemed to have dropped off. Yasmin, please go for it.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much. I must say, I do agree with needing to have more robust conversations. And I do think the problem we face is that people are uncomfortable, do feel awkward about things, and worry about what is polite or the right way of saying things. So I agree with you completely there. And I wonder, I wasn't on the previous session, but I wonder if, to the point of people being uncomfortable with it, how many participants you had at the previous session as compared to this one.
It's actually a very good point. Let's not get into a state of making theories that can't be supported by evidence. But I was actually wondering, because I'm dealing with my own mental models, how many people would come and talk about a critical issue like this, even if it is to disagree to the previous one. But as you also point out, we might just be totally wrong. Maybe it's got nothing to do with that.
that is the case, load shedding being part of the problem as well.
Sure.
But I do think that the people who do arrive to these things are people who need to continue having the conversations, open up the doors, find the people that you can talk to, and then to Kutwana's point on reflection, let's reflect on ourselves and what we bring to the conversation and what we don't. So when I hesitate to say something, I need to reflect on why in this moment of time am I hesitating? When I speak up, why in this moment of time am I willing to speak up versus in another instance? So am I white enough now? Am I Black enough now? Am I middle race enough now? And we need to have those reflective thoughts about what is it about this context that allows me to say it versus in another context that makes me uncomfortable. And if we can start speaking about those things openly and authentically with each other, then perhaps we can move forward.
Exactly. It is about authentic conversation. I couldn't have said better what you've just said, Yasmin. It's continuously asking ourselves, what exactly is going on? Why am I reacting like this? When I'm amongst my colored community, are there things that just flows over my head when there is actually a racist statement being made? And should I challenge? I had to, earlier this year, I had to challenge my own sister and say to her, no, you can't use that word. It is wrong to use it. And let me explain why is it a problem. Because what can happen in some instances is that we become quiet because it's our family and you don't want to upset. They'll say, yeah, you're spoiling the party here now, we're just making fun. But if the fun is at the expense of other people, we have to say no. We have to say, no, there's a problem here. And you're absolutely right, it's continuously checking ourselves around these kind of things. Thanks very much for that input, Yasmin.
Thank you.
Zonke, we were looking for you and load shedding took you somewhere else. Please go for it.
Thanks, Dr. Andrew. I mean, I'm not going to take long with the interest of time, but I had actually a question that was more related to Kutwana, so I'm very glad that you touched on that, even though I did not catch some of your insights. And actually at work, we have started to have these conversations, and my goodness, it is very uncomfortable. And especially if the space is not contained, it can go either ways, but as we always say, this is a process. This is a process of, starting something new and something different.
Absolutely.
And also my observation is that organizational psychology as a field does not really touch on these things. When you talk about critical race theory, it's something that will be introduced in a more sociological perspective, or if you've done psychology, like pure psychology, then you'll be introduced into those things. But organizational psychology, there's a bit of detachment into all these social issues that you are talking about here. And perhaps this is more aligned to what Ruwen was saying about knowledge production. Maybe you should start thinking about how we then produce knowledge within organizational psychology as a field per se. And I was thinking about this idea, thinking about, how you said about a Black person, how a Black person and a Black body has always been associated with this negativity, and how that can be so damaging to a Black psyche and a Black mentality, which is something that maybe will take a while to dismantle these perceptions that we are living with. But it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and it's not about it's a community effort, and I'm just thinking maybe these conversations need to be pushed forward, even for the people in the community level, because that's where we see all of these things happening in the lower ground. So maybe it's a start of a process where we have to push the conversation and reach people at a lower level, so that so let me stop here. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, and I think just to hopefully, last week, we're beginning to try and engage the HODs. I spoke at the HOD forum last week, and what we had gone to put, there were 3 issues, but I'll just talk about the one issue which I put on the agenda, because we said that the process of dealing with these issues is going to be across the board from different aspects, whether it is the academic training of our people, the experiential development in the internship, and people taking up employment, whether self-employed or in organizations. All of those levels would have to be tackled by this issue, but here in this instance, academia. So last week I addressed the HODs, and it was specifically to begin to put the issue from our point of view on the agenda of the HODs. So for example, we said things that would need to be addressed here, and we're not bringing answers, we say, let's find the answers together, is around curricula. Are these, when we speak about decolonized curricula, what does it mean for psychology? What does it mean in terms of thinking around within that context differently about how the challenges of Black students are very vastly different from white students? Does the system sufficiently take account of that kind of challenge that a Black student would have? Or, for example, the research that is happening, is sufficient research happening around issues of transformation or even race and so on? I just saw that a webinar or a seminar or something was held by SAISA now recently in collaboration with UNISA, also about race and racism. And that's what we have to promote. We, for example, we look at the issue of the agenda of the conference, and are there enough issues that deal with issues around transformation? And we're trying to push this idea. Obviously, these workshops happening in Siopsa is another process that we are pushing to help for better conversation to happen around these issues. And so just to say to you, we have opened that conversation with them, and we will ensure that we continue to talk to them around the very issues that are, of importance in terms of dealing with the issue of racism, and learning around lenses like CRT that can help us make sense of some of these issues in the broader scope of transformation. So thanks very much for that input, Zonke. And I think you just reminded us, and I'll end off there. I know, thanks for those who stayed. I know some people had to go. And these conversations, again, are not intended to give a final answer. It's trying to open up to say, we better talk about these issues because they are important. They're clumsy because I might give some input, but there might be other ideas how we can think about it. Most of all, if the conversations we're having here doesn't make us feel uncomfortable, then perhaps there will never be a chance for change in society, because change and learning only happens in a space of discomfort, because we don't want to let go of our own particular comfort zone, and learning can only happen if we do feel uncomfortable. Colleagues, I'm going to end there and really thank you for those who have stayed on, and appreciate your inputs here and learning for us together. Our next one will be in a month's time, and we'll be talking about whiteness as an ideology. So thank you very much for your time, and good evening to all of you.